The first thing you learn inside the belly of an Imperial tank is that suffering has a sound. It isn't the roar of the engine or the pounding of artillery outside. It's the groan of metal that's been asked to endure too much, the rattle of a panel held together by rust and prayer, the whisper of recirculated air tasting faintly of oil, sweat, and recycled fear. Inside these machines, the galaxy reduces itself to a shaking steel coffin hurtling through fire. The outside world becomes a rumor you feel through the hull. Every vibration is a question, every impact a judgment, and every breath stolen from the recycled warmth of 4 souls, who know they will die long before the tank ever truly does. And yet, this is where heroes are broken and born. If you can feel the tremor of that steel around you, if the darkness of the tank's interior is already closing in, help this story keep moving through the void by lending a moment of support like share and subscribe so the channel can keep its engine running just a little longer. The first breath inside the tank is always the hardest, though no one ever warns you about it. It isn't the recycled taste of old sweat and promethium fumes that unsettles the lungs, nor the metallic sting of air that's passed through too many filters and too many desperate lungs. It's the realization that this will be the only air you breathe for hours, days, sometimes weeks, and that it has nowhere to go except into the same stale loop of human exhalation and engine heat. When the hatch slams shut, the world outside vanishes instantly, as though someone has folded reality into a tin cube and demanded you live inside it. Light becomes an afterthought, time loses shape, and the steel walls press inward, not with malice, but with indifference so immense it might as well be divine. The interior is narrower than memory ever allows. Every crewman insists it gets smaller each time they deploy, though we all know the tank hasn't changed. What changes is us. Shoulders grow more tense, breaths become shorter, and each rattle of an armor plate sounds closer than it should. The tank does not care if you need space for fear or doubt. It gives you none. It only gives you your station, your duty, and the constant reminder that this place is both a weapon and a womb, one that births death as much as it attempts to shelter you from it. Sergeant Colin always sits first, lowering himself into the commander's seat like a man taking the throne of some forgotten kingdom. The dim lumens trace the harsh lines of his face, revealing cheeks hollowed by too many campaigns, and eyes permanently narrowed in the half-suspicion of men who have watched the enemy change shapes too many times. He runs a gloved hand along the Auspex console with something approaching reverence, whispering the rights in a voice that barely rises above the hum of the idling engine. The tank's machine spirit is fickle, and his murmured blessings are the only thing keeping it from spiting us. Or at least, that's what he believes. In truth, we all believe it. You don't survive inside these iron coffins by doubting the rituals. Doubt gets you killed more efficiently than any lasbolt. Garin, our gunner, squeezes past me with the graceless shuffle of someone who has bruised their ribs too many times on these same metal edges. He's younger than the rest of us, but the soot smeared across his cheeks and the twitch in his eyelids make him look older, like the tank has stolen years from him and fed them into its own ancient stomach. He wipes a small circle of clarity onto his cracked targeting scope, grunting as he adjusts the elevation cogitator. The ritual is simple and instinctive. Clean, calibrate, whisper the forgiving litany to the turret's hydraulics before it decides to lock in place for no reason other than spite. Garin never smiles, not because he's humorless, but because smiling inside a tank feels wrong, like offending some unseen presence that lives in the pipes and circuit-laced sinews of the hull. Down near the hull's floor, beneath layers of armor and forgotten screws, sits Halvek, our driver. He is little more than a silhouette in the dark recess where the control harnesses reside, his form bent forward over the levers and pedals that will guide us through mud, fire, and the scattered bones of infantry foolish enough to stand in our path. Halvek barely speaks. He communicates in grunts, in the angle of his head, in the subtle tension of his shoulders, when the tank reverberates with distant artillery. He is the only one among us who seems made for this place. If the rest of us leave the tank, we become human again. But Halvek only becomes himself when the engine growls to life. There is something soothing in the way he places his palms on the driving sticks, as though touching a beast he's tamed through patience and suffering. And then there's me, Remin, loader, and deeper, caretaker of the gun's endless appetite. My world is defined by the weight of shells stacked like ominous monoliths along the interior walls. Their cold metal casings brush my fingertips each time the tank lurches, whispering promises of recoil and thunder. My station is a cramped alcove between Garin and the cannon's breech, where the smell of propellant never truly fades, and the bruises from recoil plates form a second skin across my arms. Loading isn't a job, it's a rhythm, a heartbeat. If I miss a beat, if I fumble a shell, or hesitate for even half a breath, we die. Tanks do not forgive hesitation. The enemy will not give you a second chance to get the shell into the chamber. The machine spirit will not excuse clumsiness. Only perfect motion keeps the line between life and annihilation from thinning into nothing. When the final lumen flickers into its dim glow, when the cramped chamber hums with that familiar oppressive symphony of engine vibration and the metallic groan of armored plates expanding under heat, the true belonging sets in. We have spent so long inside this iron beast that the silence outside feels alien. The tank's interior is a strange sanctuary, harsh, suffocating, but known. The outside world is chaos, unpredictability, open sky that feels too large and too fragile compared to the crafted suffocation of steel. The rites begin with the simple ignition of the engine core, yet it always feels like awakening a sleeping god. The Vox grill crackles as Colin recites the prayer of activation, each word vibrating through the hull as though the tank itself is responding. Halvek flips the ignition runes, and instantly the interior becomes a furnace of rattling life. The engine's roar is deafening, a bellow that fills the lungs and skull like liquid thunder. The vibrations climb up through the floor, shaking teeth in their sockets, and every loose tool or unsecured round clatters in a frantic metallic chorus. The tank is no longer an object. It is a creature, awakened and hungry, demanding motion. Once the engine settles into its steady growl, the walls seem to breathe. Metal expands with warmth. Shadows shift as lumens struggle against the rhythmic flicker caused by the power draw. A thin haze of exhaust creeps along the ceiling before the fans begin their low drone, cycling the air with the efficiency of exhausted lungs. The temperature rises fast, making sweat bead along the back of my neck into the collar of my uniform. The tank always feels warmer than it should, as if it absorbs our fear and stress and exudes it back as heat. The air tastes of machine oil and the faint acidic tang of solder. After a few minutes, you stop smelling it, either by getting used to it, or because your senses finally give up. Garin taps his targeting console 3 times to test the calibration. The turret shifts with a groaning protest, metal grinding against metal, a sound that could be mistaken for agony if you let your imagination wander. But imagination is dangerous inside the tank. It makes the walls too alive. It makes the shadows too long. Colin's calm voice echoes through the hull as he runs the machine spirit's status checks, his words steady and unwavering. In the faint glow, his eyes reflect the Auspex runes like twin embers in the half-dark. This is where our world begins, always the same, yet always different, because today will not be like the countless days before it. You can feel it in the air, something taut, something strained. The hum of the engine doesn't settle into its usual rhythm but shudders intermittently, like a heartbeat under stress. The Vox picks up faint bursts of chatter, distorted and panicked, as other crews murmur prayers, status reports, or last messages to whoever might be listening on the other end. War has already begun outside, though we haven't rolled an inch. Halvek shifts in his seat, his fingers flexing around the driving sticks. I can hear the wet click of his knuckles. Garin clears his throat, a nervous gesture he tries to hide. Even Colin, immovable as carved stone, grimaces when the Auspex flares red for a moment before stabilizing. Something about this deployment is wrong. Something in the way the tank vibrates, in the way the air grows thick as sweat and incense smoke, tells us that this time the machine spirit is wary. And if the machine spirit fears what lies outside, then so should we. But fear has no space in this iron womb. There is only duty, repetition, the comfort of practiced motions. I run a hand over the nearest shell, feeling the smooth curve of its casing. Each round is a promise. Each one is a declaration that we will survive by making sure someone else doesn't. The shells are heavier today, or perhaps my arms are weaker, Perhaps the very air drains strength from us, preparing us for the moment when the hatch seals us off from everything except the battle. Colin switches to the external vox, his voice sharpening as he makes contact with command. The response is garbled, drowned in static and distant screams. We exchange glances, we pretend it's normal, but the truth hangs between us like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. We are being sent somewhere worse than usual, somewhere where other crews are already dying, somewhere the tank's armor may not be enough. Outside, we can faintly hear the rumble of artillery. The sound is soft, filtered through layers of plasteel and ceramite, but it is unmistakable. War is not approaching, it is already here. The tank shudders as the ground trembles beneath it, and a fine layer of dust falls from the overhead pipes. The walls feel closer, the air warmer, the shadows deeper. This is the last moment before the tank becomes our entire universe, the final breath before confinement becomes reality. Colin meets each of our eyes in turn. No words are needed. We are already bound by unspoken acceptance. We will ride forward. We will face whatever horror waits beyond the armored hull. And if we die, the tank will remember us only as heat stains and scuffed metal. Halvek pulls the driving levers back. The engine roars. The tank lurches forward. The womb becomes a weapon, and the world outside begins to disappear. The first jolt always arrives without warning. Even when you expect it, even when your muscles brace and your jaw clenches in anticipation, the moment the tank's tracks bite into the rubble outside and the entire hull lurches forward, it hits with the force of a falling world. The impact reverberates through every rib, rattling the teeth and knocking loose whatever illusions of control you thought you had. The iron womb becomes a hammer, and we become nails driven into its steel interior. Outside, the war zone opens like a festering wound. Inside, we only feel its tremors. The world beyond the armor plates dissolves into vibration and muffled violence. Each rotation of the tracks sends tremors through the metal floor, a constant brutal massage that bruises shins and rattles equipment. The tank growls as it pushes over shattered ferrocrete and the broken remnants of walls that once belonged to homes, manufactoria, or something unidentifiable beneath centuries of accumulated Imperial decay. The engine heat rises, turning the confined space into a kiln of sweat and breath. The recirculation fans do their best, but their whine sounds strain today, like they resent our presence. Garin curses under his breath as the turret balks at his command, shuddering before finally rotating. He smacks the side of the targeting console with a practiced palm, the gesture as familiar as a heartbeat. "Machine spirit's in a mood," he mutters, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice sounds too loud in the enclosed chamber, bouncing off the walls with the sharpness of frayed nerves. Halvek answers with a low grunt, but his hands remain steady on the driving sticks. No matter how vicious the terrain becomes, he holds those controls with an animal instinct, as though he senses the tank's movement through bones rather than sight. Colin peers through the commander's periscope slit, his face illuminated by the faint runic glow of the auspex. His voice filters through the vox with measured control, enemy movement ahead, scattered infantry, possible armor signatures beyond the ridge. His tone never wavers, even as a rumble shakes dust from the ceiling dish onto his shoulders. He gives the information calmly, as if discussing the weather on Terra rather than the shapes of men about to die. The Vox grill crackles with the panic of other units, reports of ambushes, of Skitari formations getting flanked, of Astra Militarum infantry lines buckling under some unseen pressure. The distortion makes the voices sound less human, like spirits wailing through rusted wires. Command tries to restore order, barking coordinates and threats of disciplinary action, but the chaos bleeds through everything. The tank becomes both shield and prison from the madness outside, but even the thick ceramite can't block out desperation. The first impact slams into us like a titan's punch. The armor absorbs the blast, but the shockwave rattles every bone in our bodies. My shoulder smashes against the ammo rack, sending a cascade of shells shifting dangerously in their brackets. I shove them back into place, fingers trembling despite myself. The smell of propellant fills the air even though we haven't fired yet, phantom scent burned into the hull from previous engagements, as familiar as old scars. "Return fire," Colin orders, voice tight now. Garen swings the turret, the cannon's massive breech groaning as it adjusts. I'm already grabbing the first shell, muscles tightening with its weight. The shell's metal is cold, despite the sweltering air, the chill sinking deep into my palms like a promise of violence. The breech opens, yawning like a beast demanding to be fed. I slam the round inside. The cannon thunks shut with finality. Garen's targeting scope flickers, runes racing across its cracked surface like frantic insects. The recoil hits before sound does. The cannon spits its thunder into the world, and the entire tank convulses violently. The blast reverberates through us, punching the breath from our lungs. Even braced, even prepared, the shock feels like being struck in the chest with a steel ram. My ears ring, vision blurs for a heartbeat, and the air fills with the metallic taste of adrenaline. Outside, something detonates. Garen reports a direct hit, voice jittering with the tremor of excitement he tries to hide. Colin doesn't praise him. Praise is meaningless until the battle ends. Instead, he gives new coordinates, his words clipped and steady. Garen adjusts. I grab another shell. Halvek navigates us into a new angle. The routine continues, the rhythm of war resuming its merciless beat. The engine's growl deepens as Halvek pushes us forward. Every bump threatens to send me sprawling across the compartment. My hands ache from gripping the shells, each one a small coffin I must deliver to the cannon's maw. Sweat trickles down my neck, mixing with grime. The heat swells, pressing against my skin in thick waves. Breathing becomes harder, like inhaling through wet cloth. The Vox crackles with screams. Someone's tank has ruptured, the crew inside roasting alive. The description is mercifully brief, swallowed by static and overlapping orders, but the image roots itself in our minds. Halvek's jaw tightens. Garen swallows hard. Colin's expression doesn't change, but the faint tremor in his voice when he repeats an Auspex reading betrays him. The next few minutes stretch into an eternity. The tank rolls over something soft outside, something that squelches, causing the entire hull to bounce slightly. None of us acknowledge it. Humanity becomes abstract from inside a tank. There are only targets and obstacles. Flesh becomes terrain. Armor ahead, Colin says, voice dipping into a growl. Prepare. A bead of cold dread rolls down my spine. Enemy armor means danger not just from outside, but from within. If their shot finds our flank, we won't have time to scream. The impact comes lightning fast. A piercing clang erupts from the right side of the hull. Sparks burst from the interior paneling. Garen ducks instinctively, shielding his targeting controls with his body. A second strike glances off the front plate, sending a shock through the tank that knocks Halvek backward. Fire! Colin commands. I load another shell with frantic force. Garen's hands glide across the controls, guiding the turret with near supernatural precision born from countless battles. The cannon roars. The recoil slams through the interior once more. There's no time to process the pain. I grab another round. Load, fire, load, fire. The world becomes thunder and heat and shaking bodies. The tank is a living storm, and we are trapped inside its fury. The enemy vehicle erupts in a plume of flame. Garen shouts the kill confirmation, even as he targets the next threat. My muscles protest, but the rhythm forces them on. Any hesitation means death. Breath burns in my throat. Sweat stings my eyes. The shells feel heavier each second, as though the tank steals my strength to fuel its hunger. The tank shudders violently as Halvek pushes us through collapsing ruins. The metal screeches in protest. Dust rains from above, coating my tongue with the gritty taste of old stone and ash. Outside, the battlefield rages like a nightmare. Even through the armor, we sense its violence, the concussive waves, the vibrations of explosions rippling through the ground, the distant whine of lasfire. Colin relays updates, his tone forced calm. Garen fires relentlessly, cursing at every jammed gear and misaligned targeting rune. Halvek drives like a man possessed, weaving between debris and fire, his movements guided by instinct more than sight. I continue loading until my arms tremble, then load some more. The tank absorbs punishment that would obliterate squads of infantry. Every blast that hits us feels like a giant's fist pounding against our ribs. There is no rest, no pause, no time to think. Only motion, duty, and the relentless grind of survival. Another hit rocks the hull. This one is close, too close. The interior lights flicker. The fans wheeze. A fire suppression system hisses briefly, spitting a foul-smelling mist into the chamber before shutting off again. Garin curses. Halvek growls. I clutch the next shell, my fingers numb. Colin's voice sharpens. We're taking too many hits. Halvek, get us behind cover. Halvek doesn't answer, he simply throws the tank into a violent turn. The tracks grind against shattered masonry. We slam sideways. The interior tilts at a nauseating angle as the tank teeters over a chunk of fallen building. For a second, I'm weightless, floating in the dim haze of heat and dust. Then gravity reasserts itself, slamming me back into the ammo rack. We skid into partial shelter, what remains of a ruined hab block. The cover won't last long, but it buys us seconds, precious seconds. The tank's engine groans, coughing like an animal on the brink of collapse. The machine's spirit is displeased, or dying, or both. Colin whispers the rights under his breath, voice shaking for the first time. Garin wipes blood from a cut above his brow. Halvek tightens his grip on the controls. I cradle the next shell, hands trembling. Outside, the war thunders on. Inside, the iron womb breathes with us, its metal heartbeat slowing, waiting. But there will be no rest. We all know the cover won't last. And the next order, when it comes, will drag us back into the grinder. The night cycle inside a Lehman Russ does not announce itself with any gentleness. It arrives as a dimming pulse along the overhead lumen strips, a weary flicker that mimics the dying gasp of a candle rather than the turn of a clock. In the cramped hold, where 5 bodies try to carve out small pockets of sanity amid belts of ammunition and racks of tools, the dimming lights feel less like rest and more like a warning. I remember sitting there in the turret well, knees pressed to the cold adamantium plating, listening to the faint hum of the reactor below my feet. It was a sound that might have soothed a novice once, but after months in the field it resembled the restless breathing of something too large to see, too angry to name, and too necessary to live without. My palms were still warm from the turret controls. My shoulders ached with the ghost of firing recoil, and somewhere behind me, someone was whispering for the Emperor's protection, not because the day had been particularly brutal, but because the night promised worse. In a tank crew, the distinction between day and night is a matter of habit rather than reality. There are no windows, only reinforced vision blocks that show little more than slivers of sky or intermittent flashes of artillery fire. The outside world becomes a rumor, passed between us in half-truths and battlefield gossip. The time of day is not measured by sun or moon, but by the rhythm of commands barked over Vox, the countdown before the next push, the silence before a bombardment, the shuddering roar of return fire. And yet we hold on to the idea of night because it offers one thing no tank ever truly provides: the illusion of stillness. The promise that, for a few hours, we might unclench our jaws and let the weight of the world rest somewhere outside our armor plates. I remember Sergeant Hask unbuckling himself from the command throne, his movements stiff as if the harness had become a part of his ribcage. The man never complained, but the straps left marks across his shoulders that looked like the scars of some old animal trying to claim him. He stretched once, twice, the crack of his joints muffled by the steady thrum of machinery. "Rotate rest," he said in his usual gravel, though none of us needed the instruction. We'd been waiting for it the moment the lights dimmed. No one sleeps more than an hour at a time. Engine stays warm. Be ready. Being ready, that was our creed, our curse, and the chain that bound us together more tightly than any oath. In the confines of our Lehman Russ, readiness meant existing in a perpetual state of near panic. Even resting was not rest. You closed your eyes, expecting the next shell to strike, the next Vox call to scream orders, the next malfunction to demand immediate repair or doom the whole squadron. Tank crews do not get to drift into unconsciousness. They nap in aggressive increments, minds half alert, bodies twitching at the slightest shudder from the engine. Every hour stretched long and brittle, like thin glass you feared would crack with any sudden motion. Trooper Vale, our gunner, was already slumped near his station, one hand still wrapped around the elevation handle. He looked younger than he was in that dim light. the boyishness returning to his face only when exhaustion softened his features. When awake, he had the eyes of someone already consigned to death, someone who had accepted that being turned to paste by a direct hit was simply part of the job. But in rest, he appeared almost innocent, and I often found myself staring at him, wondering who he might have been if the Imperium hadn't scooped him up and poured him into a war machine. I think we all imagined alternate versions of ourselves, farmers, builders, scribes, lives untouched by the constant scream of war. It was a cruel indulgence, one we rarely admitted aloud. I unlatched my harness and slid down beside the ammo racks, propping my back against a crate stamped with the Imperial Aquila. The metal was cold and familiar against my spine. My eyelids felt heavy, but sleep hovered just out of reach. The moment I dipped too close, the tank itself would yawn or groan or jolt with some internal shift, and my heart would slam against my ribs as if expecting a detonation. That was the nature of armored service. Even your sanctuary was an accomplice to your fear. There was a moment, brief but vivid, that came to define that night. The Vox emitted a faint crackle, not a call, not a message, just a ripple of static that slithered across my nerves. Hask's head snapped toward it, his instincts sharp as a wolf's. Vale jolted awake, hand twitching toward controls that were no longer engaged. For several seconds, none of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, thickened by the oppressive weight of uncertainty. Was it a sign of movement outside? An enemy patrol brushing too close? A malfunction? Or simply the ghost of some distant broadcast? Caught in the atmospheric churn. In the Imperium, horrors travel freely through Vox channels, stray screams, corrupted chants, encrypted orders gone sour. None of us wanted to imagine what might be clawing at the edges of that static. The crackle faded. Hask exhaled. "Just interference," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. He returned to his station, checking the external pict feed once more before settling. But the moment had already seeped into us, coiling inside our thoughts like a parasite. The night felt different after that, thinner, more fragile, as though the darkness outside pressed harder against the hull. Sleep eventually found me, though it came more like an ambush than a mercy. I drifted into fragmented dreams, the roar of battle replaying itself, the cloying stench of promethium smoke, the image of a shell screaming toward us. I saw flashes of faces, the ones we had lost weeks prior, half-remembered comrades whose names had already blurred into the endless churn of attrition. The dead never truly leave tank crews. Not when you've scrubbed their blood from the walls. Not when you know the spot they died in, the angle their bodies bent at, the sound they made. You carry those ghosts like extra weight in your gear, silent passengers who remind you that your turn may come at any moment. A sudden tapping woke me, a rhythmic pattern on the hull. My breath lodged in my throat. Was it movement outside? Some Xenos scout? A stray round? Hask lifted a hand, signaling silence. We listened, all of us straining to interpret the faint vibrations. The tapping repeated, softer this time, then vanished altogether. After several agonizing seconds, the sergeant's posture eased. "Temperature shift," he said quietly. "Metal settling." None of us contradicted him, though Vale's expression revealed what we all felt, doubt mixed with the small, poisonous seed of fear. The truth was, tanks creak and settle constantly as the engine cools or heats, as the frame adjusts to stress, as pressure pockets release. But the noises become ominous when you're trapped inside a war zone with no visibility, and every threat feels like it's breathing directly onto the hull. Your brain begins to assign meaning to sound, crafting horrors where none exist. That is how tank madness starts slowly, disguised as caution, then paranoia, then certainty that something is stalking you through the darkness. After the tapping faded, Hask ordered another rest rotation. My hour was up. I dragged myself to the engine compartment, performing the routine checks we all knew by heart. The reactor sang its deep metallic note, heat radiating through the armored casing like a heartbeat. I found comfort in that warmth, despite the danger it represented. A living tank was a safe tank. A quiet tank was a tomb waiting to fill. When I returned to the main compartment, Hask gestured for me to take over the vigilance watch. I nodded, sliding onto the reefer, gunner's secondary seat, eyes fixed on the limited pict feed still functioning at this hour. The lens was smeared with dirt and soot, but it captured enough of the barren landscape outside to maintain our awareness. The horizon was a jagged smear of ruined hab blocks, their skeletal frames illuminated by occasional streaks of artillery fire in the distance. The sky glowed faintly from chemical clouds drifting through the region, turning the night into a toxic palette of sickly greens and ashen greys. The stillness was deceptive. Any moment, a tyrannid vanguard brood might emerge from the rubble, or a band of orcs might roar into view, hungry for destruction. Even traitor legions could be lurking, waiting to tear open armored hulls just to see the fear inside. The galaxy offered no shortage of horrors that viewed a lone tank as a challenge rather than a threat. As the hours stretched on, the weight of responsibility settled upon me like sediment. Tank crews live on a knife's edge. One mistake, one lapse, and everyone dies together. There is no escape when the hull is breached, no retreat when the ammunition detonates, no second chances when the engine goes cold. We survive through precision, instinct, and the small miracle that the Emperor's gaze sometimes lingers long enough to spare us. The next jolt of fear came not from outside but from within. Midway through my shift, the reactor hiccuped a tiny fluctuation that made the lights flicker again. My breath hitched. "Sergeant," I whispered, too sharply. Hask was awake instantly, eyes alert. The fluctuation stabilized, the thrum returning to normal. A minor glitch, nothing more. But in that moment, I saw genuine fear in Hask's eyes, a fleeting expression he quickly buried. If the engine failed, we were dead. Not metaphorically, literally. The night would swallow us whole, and we would be gutted by whatever found us first. He placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "It's stable," he murmured. "We move at dawn." That promise that we would not stay entombed in this steel coffin longer than necessary breathed fresh strength into me. Dawn meant motion, and motion meant purpose. Tanks were never meant to sleep. They existed to crush, to roll, to burn through the enemy lines. When they stood still too long, they felt like prey. The last hour of the night was the hardest. Fatigue clawed at my senses. My vision blurred, the pict feed flickered, and then, just as the first hints of filtered daylight bled through the horizon haze, the Vox crackled again, this time not with static, but with a coded ping. Hask sprang to full alert. Vale jolted upright. Bren cursed awake. Incoming orders. The illusion of rest shattered instantly. The longest night inside steel was over, and the day would demand a price none of us were ready to pay. Dawn in a war zone never arrives with grace. It doesn't warm the skin or paint the horizon with soft colors the way old storybooks claim. It claws its way over the shattered skyline with the desperation of something struggling for breath. Inside the lemon Russ, dawn was not light, but vibration. The low, rising hum of the reactor, feeding power to the drive systems. The trembling tension in the hull as centuries-old machinery awakened. The faint stirrings of 5 soldiers who knew they were being pulled back into the living furnace of battle. When the new orders came through the Vox, their tone was clipped and urgent, stripped of anything resembling reassurance. We were to advance 3 clicks east, secure a breach in the line, and hold against whatever had carved it open. No mention of what enemy force lay waiting, no promise of reinforcements. Just coordinates, a timestamp, and the implication that failure would doom an entire flank. Hask repeated the orders, his voice steady but lined with the fatigue he didn't have the luxury to admit. His command throne hissed as he locked himself into place, and the tank shifted beneath us with the first push of the accelerator. The engine growled like some ancient beast waking after too little rest, its heat crawling through the floor plates as we rolled forward. Vale checked the turret rotation, hands flicking across the familiar controls with mechanical precision. Bren adjusted the shell feeder. I scanned the pict feed, its grainy lens offering only a jittering glimpse of a world made of ruins and dust. Everything was motion, noise, responsibility. The night had ended. The abyss had begun. We emerged from our temporary hollow into a wasteland that had once been a city square. The roads had long since been reduced to jagged scars, their metal sublayers exposed and twisted. Statues toppled in the distance, their stone faces cracked into blank, unrecognizable fragments. The air shimmered with lingering smoke, rising from artillery impacts still cooling from the night's bombardment. The world felt wounded, its breath slow and uneven. Through the streaked vision blocks, I caught glimpses of frozen corpses half buried under debris, their limbs stiffened in whatever posture they'd died in, reaching, shielding, fleeing. Civilians, guardsmen, enemy fighters. Death didn't differentiate. The Vox crackled again, this time with screams in the far distance. Transmission bleed from another regiment, maybe kilometers away. There was a frantic rhythm to the noise, the unmistakable cadence of men dying faster than they could comprehend what was killing them. The signal cut off abruptly, leaving behind a hollow silence that weighed heavily in the tank. Hask didn't comment. None of us did. In the Astra Militarum, hearing another unit break is like hearing a building collapse behind you. You don't need to turn around to know you're next. We followed the rubble-lined avenue east, treads grinding over shattered masonry. The tank lurched with each impact, but Hask kept us steady. The sun, or what passed for it on this chemically scarred world, filtered through the dust, staining the sky an ugly amber. The rising light revealed more bodies, more ruins, more evidence of a battle we hadn't been present for but were now expected to correct. Every few meters, I saw scorch marks that looked nothing like the burn patterns of bolter fire or lasguns. These were arcs of organic acid, etched into the stone with irregular patterns, as though something had spit death across the landscape with no discernible direction or logic. Tyranids, I realized, or at least a strain we hadn't encountered yet. If Hask came to the same conclusion, he didn't voice it. Vale murmured a half-formed prayer under his breath. Bren tightened his grip on a shell casing. The air felt colder despite the heat of the engine. We reached the breach in the line an hour later. At first, it looked like a collapsed hab block. Then I saw the organic texture woven into the ruin, the ribbed channels carved into the stone, the pulpy residue smeared along collapsed walls. Something had burrowed through here, something large. The Vox chimed with a tactical update. Unidentified Tyranid bioform activity detected in your sector. Extreme caution advised. The voice was sterile, unfazed by its own words. It felt like an insult. Machines didn't know fear. We did. Hask ordered us to hold position near the breach, angled toward the darkest corridor of rubble. The turret pointed forward. The heavy bolter rattled once as Vale performed a final test burst. Shell casings clinked on the metal floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the cramped compartment. For several minutes, nothing moved. It was the kind of stillness that makes your heartbeat seem hostile, too loud, too irregular. The picked feed showed only drifting dust and distant motionless shapes. The engine idled with a deep rumble. Sweat beaded down my neck despite the chill. Then, a faint vibration rippled through the ground. Not from artillery, not from the tank, something else. The next sound was a piercing shriek, high, chittering, alien. It echoed through the ruins as dozens of scuttling forms surged into view. They broke from cover with explosive momentum, leaping from walls and ceilings. Gaunts, a full swarm. Their eyes glimmered with predatory hunger, limbs slicing the air with sickening speed. Engage, Hask roared. The world became recoil, thunder, and steel. Vale fired the battle cannon, the cannon's roar shattering the tight confines of the hull. The recoil slammed through my bones, but the sight on the screen was glorious. The shell detonated in the heart of the swarm, vaporizing dozens of the creatures and scattering ichor across the ruins. But they didn't slow. If anything, they accelerated. Tyranids didn't fear death. They didn't comprehend loss. They simply absorbed it, flowed around it, and continued killing. Bren fed shell after shell into the gun. Hask adjusted our position to avoid being surrounded. The hull, heavy bolter, chattered with endless fury, each burst carving ragged trenches into the advancing horde. But for every creature that fell, 3 more took its place. They reached the tank with terrifying speed. Claws scraped against the armor. Chitins screeched across steel. The hull trembled as bodies slammed against it. I heard the unmistakable sound of talons trying to pierce maintenance seams. One gaunt climbed onto the right fender, its fanged maw inches from the vision block. Its breath fogged the reinforced glass. Vale swiveled the coaxial stubber, shredding it point blank, and painting the window in greenish gore. But then the ground shook again, harder, heavier. A new silhouette emerged from the corridor, massive, spined, rippling with muscle and plated armor. A Carnifex. Its roar split the air, a primal blast of hatred that reverberated through the tank. Like a physical force, my teeth rattled. Bren swore. Hask barked for full elevation. Vale swung the turret, but the Carnifex charged with terrifying strength, crushing swarming gaunts under its bulk, as if they were nothing more than insects. "Fire!" Hask commanded. The battle cannon spat flame. The shell struck the Carnifex in the shoulder, exploding in a shower of flesh and carapace. The beast staggered, but did not fall. It kept running. It hit us like a runaway starship. The tank jolted sideways, nearly tipping. Alarms screamed, tools clattered to the floor. My head snapped against the turret rim, stars bursting across my vision. I tasted blood. The world spun. Vale cursed as he struggled to realign the turret. Bren slammed his shoulder against the loader arm. Hask gripped the controls, forcing the treads to bite into the broken ground before we rolled. The Carnifex reared up, slamming both of its scythe arms onto the hull. The metal buckled, plating groaned. The creature's enormous head lowered, ramming into the turret ring, trying to wrench it open. Inside the tank, panic clawed its way up my throat. "Reload!" Vale shouted. "Doing it!" Bren answered, jamming a new shell into the breach with frantic strength. The Carnifex hammered the turret again. A shower of sparks rained over us. One more blow might breach the armor. I heard the beast's snarling breath, hot and wet, seeping through microscopic gaps. "Fire!" Hask roared, voice cracking. Vale pulled the trigger. The cannon erupted. At this range, the blast was suicidal for anything not encased in a tank's armor. The shell struck the Carnifex dead center, ripping through flesh and bone and detonating inside its massive torso. The explosion tore the beast apart. Its body collapsed against the hull, then slid off, leaving a smear of ichor and shattered carapace dripping onto the ground. Silence followed. A silence filled not with peace, but with the trembling aftershock of violence. Survived by inches. Gaunts screeched and scattered, the loss of their monstrous anchor breaking their coordination. Hask seized the moment, maneuvering the tank into a better firing line. Vale and Bren annihilated the retreating swarm piece by piece until the ruins returned to uneasy stillness. Inside the Lehman Russ, none of us spoke for a long time. My hands shook. Vale wiped blood from his forehead. Bren leaned against the loader arm, chest heaving. Hask kept staring at the picked feed, eyes scanning for movement, even though we all knew nothing else would dare approach us for several minutes. The engine hummed. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and the faint, acrid hint of tyrannid gore. We had survived. Barely. As the tension eased, the enormity of what had happened began to settle over us like thick dust. Tank crews talk about the abyss moment, the instant when the line between survival and annihilation becomes razor thin, when the tank feels less like armor and more like a coffin being carved open. What we had just endured was one such moment, and deep down, beneath the fear, I felt something colder, a certainty that the abyss wasn't done with us yet. Outside, the ruins shifted. Something bigger was coming, but that was for the next chapter. The ruins around us settled into a tense quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, not the breath before dawn or the pause between artillery volleys, but the suffocating stillness of a hunter circling outside the reach of our senses. Every crewman felt it. Even the engine's familiar hum seemed hesitant, as though the machine itself feared drawing attention. Hask leaned forward in his command throne, his eyes tracing the jagged skyline with the steady focus of someone who had lived through too many ambushes to trust silence. Vale kept the turret rotating in slow, careful increments, scanning every broken archway and collapsed road. Bren checked the shell reserves again, even though we all knew the numbers by heart. And I watched the picked feed, waiting for the moment the shadows would stop behaving like shadows. When the first tremor rolled beneath us, I knew it wasn't distant artillery. It was rhythmic, heavy, measured. Not the chaotic scrabbling of gaunts or the thunderous charge of a Carnifex. This was something far bigger, moving with purpose. Hask's jaw tightened. Vale's hands paused over the controls. Bren whispered a curse under his breath. The tank felt suddenly smaller, its armor thinner, its weapons less certain. A second tremor followed, then a third. The ruins around us shed dust as though exhaling. The Vox crackled with static, then with a fragmented warning. Mass biosignature, approaching, unknown class, Emperor help. The signal collapsed into a screech of interference. No updates, no reinforcements. We were alone, sitting in the middle of a Tyranid feeding ground with a tank running low on ammunition and a crew running low on nerve. Hask issued no heroic speech. He simply said, "Hold your positions," in a tone that made the order feel like a prayer spoken through clenched teeth. And then it appeared. Even through the distortion of the picked feed, the creature was colossal, towering over the ruins, its silhouette blotting out what little light seeped through the dust-choked sky. Multiple limbs ended in scything talons. Its thorax pulsed with unnatural life, each movement making the ground quiver. It was a Tyranid bioform I didn't recognize, but its presence shifted something deep inside me. It felt wrong on a level that bypassed rational thought, triggering an instinct older than language. Run. But we couldn't. A Lehman Russ does not run. It advances, fires, endures, and dies. The creature let out a shuddering roar that rattled the tank's interior. It was not a roar of anger or fear. It was a declaration, a territorial claim, a challenge, a promise of consumption. Smaller Tyranids skittered around its legs, drawn to its presence like insects to a flame. Its eyes, if they could be called that, swept across the battlefield before locking onto the tank with predatory certainty. Vale exhaled slowly. Target acquired. Load anti-armor, Hask ordered. Bren slid a heavy penetrator, round into the breach, locking it in place with a metallic click. The weight of it grounded us. This was the kind of shell you used against enemy armor, fortified positions, or, on rare occasions, nightmares made flesh. Fire. The battle cannon erupted in a blast that shook every bolt in the hull. The shell streaked across the ruins, embedding itself in the creature's torso. The explosion tore open a gaping wound, spraying ichor and chunks of chitin. The beast staggered, its massive frame buckling. But it did not fall. Instead, it let out another roar deeper, more enraged and charged. The ground shook violently as it barreled toward us, crushing debris beneath its weight. Smaller Tyranids scrambled ahead, swarming over the rubble in a wave of claws and mandibles. Vale fired again, this time with an armor-piercing, high-explosive shell, shredding dozens of the lesser creatures, but barely slowing the giant. Hask slammed the controls, reversing the tank with a violent jolt. The treads screeched against stone. Gaunts leapt onto the hull, their claws scraping for purchase. I fired the coaxial stubber, mowing down a cluster of them as they tried to rip open the maintenance panel. Their bodies fell away in pieces, but the swarm kept coming. "Reload!" Vale barked. "On it!" Bren grunted, ramming another shell into the chamber. The giant Tyranid was nearly on top of us. It lowered its scythe limbs, preparing to slice open the turret like a tin can. Vale took the shot. The cannon bucked with thunderous recoil. The shell hit the bioform's neck, severing one of its limbs. The creature shrieked, stumbling sideways, smashing through a pile of rubble as it fell. But the other limb came down on us anyway, slamming into the tank with a force that sent the world spinning. The hull groaned. The lights flickered. Bren was thrown against the loader arm. I hit the console hard enough to momentarily blur my vision. "Status," Hask yelled. "Turret ring. Damaged," Vale shouted back. "Rotation slowing." "Engine's good," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to steady it. Rear plate dented but intact. A crash against the side told us the Gaunts had reached us again. Their bodies clattered across the armor, their screeches cut through the air. And then the giant moved again. It rose, staggering, ichor pouring from its wounds but not dying, not retreating. The bioform's resilience felt impossible, as if the hive mind refused to relinquish such an investment of flesh and mass. It dragged itself forward, fueled not by instinct but by a single, overwhelming directive: kill the tank. Hask's knuckles whitened on the controls. Vale, one more shot. One more shell, Bren confirmed, grabbing the last penetrator round. The giant lunged, its broken form terrifying in its stubborn endurance. The tank fired once more. The shell hit the creature square in the chest, punching through its exposed cavity before, detonating deep inside its core. The resulting explosion tore the monster apart from within, its entire torso collapsing in a grotesque implosion of bone and meat. The creature collapsed with a final, shuddering tremor, its massive frame sliding to the ground in a pool of thick ichor. Silence followed. Real silence. The surviving Gaunts, leaderless and disoriented, scattered back into the ruins, their hive connection fractured by the death of their massive anchor. The ground no longer trembled, the air no longer vibrated with alien roars. The battlefield felt abandoned, as though some unseen curtain had been pulled shut. Inside the tank, we remained still, listening, waiting. Finally, Bren let out a ragged laugh, half mad and fully exhausted. Vale slumped back in his seat. I wiped blood from my forehead, realizing only then that I'd been struck by a flying rivet. Hask closed his eyes for a moment, brief, but long enough to reveal the weight he carried. We had survived the abyss. Again. But survival in the Astra Militarum is not victory. It is simply the right to die another day. The Vox finally reactivated, its static clearing enough to reveal the crisp voice of a distant command officer. All units, the enemy assault in your sector has been repelled. Reinforcements en route. Hold position until relieved. The words felt almost unreal. Reinforcements, relief, concepts so alien to our usual existence that they bordered on fantasy. Hask exhaled slowly, then keyed the comm. This is Lehman Russ Resolute. Position secure. As the message transmitted, I looked out through the cracked vision block at the ruins around us. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of Xenos, monstrosities, and fallen soldiers alike. Smoke drifted from distant fires. The sky was still choked with dust. But something about the stillness felt earned, as though the ground itself acknowledged the blood we had shed to claim it, if only for an hour. Vale broke the silence. "Think this'll make it into the regimental logs?" Bren snorted. "They won't believe half of it." I couldn't help but smile, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was collapse. Hask stood from his command throne, stretching the fatigue from his shoulders. "We'll make sure it's recorded," he said quietly. "A tank crew is more than steel and treads. It's memory, and memory deserves to endure." Outside, the first hints of distant engines echoed through the ruins, friendly armor moving toward our position. The sound carried a promise, faint but real. We were no longer alone, but as I watched the smoke rise, I knew this would not be the last time we faced the abyss. Not the last time a monster tried to crack our hull. Not the last time we would cling to life inside this metal coffin we called home. Because that was the brutal truth of a tank crew in Warhammer 40K. The war never ends. Only the chapters do. And ours had just been written. In steel, fire, and the bones of giants.